Still waiting to see if that, oh, there we go. Okay.
Is that displaying? Is everybody able to see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Good on my
perfect.
end.
Is it legible? Because we were making sure. All right.
Yes.
Perfect. Good afternoon to everybody that's on. Happy to be here. My name is, of course, as you can see on the moniker, Dr. Merrick Watchorn. I am the program chair for the Quantum Security Alliance. I also have the distinction of being the co-founder for this particular organization. Every once in a while, you get to dream something in your mind, and then you get to make it a reality. In this context, the QSA is made up some very, very leading technology edge field persons that agreed to come and join the QSA to start to lend their views and perspective to both how quantum is going to affect their industry of science and relative to how it would then affect to cybersecurity. So we didn't just ask them to look at it from one perspective. We started to ask them how they saw it from an ecosystem impact. The QSA has written a number of white papers. At this time, we've written 20 to 25. Some of them are based on understanding of how you can do certain things with atoms, how you can do certain things with water, how you can build a quantum supply chain. Some of it's even getting so far into how you can take a look at what we call counter-espionage behaviors and stuff like that. So again, the QSA is a non-for-profit research foundation organization, and we're very excited here to be here. With that, I'm just going to go on to the next slide. If I can get it to work with me, I do apologize. Can everybody see that? Let me see if I can make that. There we go. My screen updated, so hopefully you guys have seen it. Okay, good.
Yep,
so
we're good.
This is kind of like an oversight. This is what we, the QSA, are worried about. We're starting to see a trend that started in the early 2009, continued and really got in a very serious way in 2013, where digital warfare strategies by various different nation states have been targeted at the United States and its allies. Actually, you can see it here. It's created a strain, if you will, on both the financial, technical, and the workforce. In the cyber domain, it makes it even a little bit harder because we have folks that are very good at certain disciplines inside cybersecurity, but inside the holistic discussion inside cyber, we're missing out on some of the nuances, right? My sons are a great example. My youngest son is a cybersecurity ethical hacker approach, and my other son is a cyber program manager. But my son in the cyber program manager world constantly runs into the conversation of, well, we want you to be able to configure a firewall. And he goes, well, that has nothing to do with managing a project that has cyber involved in it. So it's one of those things where we sometimes get a piece of the understanding and we don't know how to properly implement it. Now, we saw the introduction of cloud computing in the first white paper by Google in 2006 as annotated, and we saw many different distributed processing capabilities. But around 2009, the White House administration actually took the thought leadership role and said, we're going to create the FedRAMP program, which is the first attempt to create what we call secure cloud. And so distributed cloud was actually nothing more than an economic affordable scale, as you can see on there. But now it's starting to get integrated with quantum. And so you now have a true hybrid environment where you have cloud that has obfuscated a lot of different things, and now you're going to put quantum in there. And currently right now, all major cloud service providers actually provide an ability to play inside a quantum environment. Some of it's simulated, some of it's not, but all major, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, all offer quantum integration modality. And most of them are starting to offer certification programs that allow you to get in there. But the adversaries that we are worried about is based on a NIST statement that our modern cryptographic-based public key system will break very, very soon when quantum becomes realized. Now, I will be very clear in saying that there's an academic discussion that's behind that statement, and we're gonna let the cryptographic people argue with the National Security Agency. What the QSA is going to say is that we are publicly supporting the viewpoint of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and we publicly support how they are viewing this discussion in the world of cryptography from the 4 different proposed solutions, even though we have written a white paper on it talking about what we saw might be the issue as well. So As we were getting ourselves really integrated with it, we began to discover that a lot of the software is written in Python. And the recent edition of the National Institute of Standards 800-218 for Secured Software Development Framework really made us stop and pause. And so I'm lucky to have a lot of cyber folks I can call and talk on the phone. I'm also an ethical hacker myself. I sit on the board for ethical hackers in the United States. I'm one of the course auditors. We look at these kinds of things to see if we're teaching the correct modality. And what we discovered is that we spend an awful lot of money trying to secure software or trying to secure things after they've already been built and handed to the operational end. And so Python, which has been around for more than 20, 25, almost 30 years, since its inception has had multiple security flaws that cannot be mitigated. But yet we're seeing it inside artificial intelligence. We see it all over the place in some forms of natural language processing. We see it in a way that a lot of the cloud emulation is being done, but it is actually considered to be one of the most unsecured software packages in the world. And of course, it's not good if the QSA is out here saying these kinds of things. We want to make sure that we are basing this in foundational statements. And the common weakness enumeration and common vulnerability and the National Vulnerability Database, all of these things are easily researchable, and you can actually verify all the things that we're about to show you today. So the pros and cons of quantum adoption is from a software perspective. So if the software is already compromised, imagine you go out and you spend your nest egg in R&D and you get a quantum product, and then you figure out this is what I'm going to do with it. Here's the pilot case. I'm putting it on the R&D, and you go to the Chief Information Security Officer or your ISM or your ISSO. And you say, hey, I want to get this accredited so we can provide this to our workforce. And then all of a sudden you start to find out that no is the new answer. And so, the old comment, orange is the new black. No is the new answer in cybersecurity because there's so much change going on. And believe it or not, we have to provide resiliency. We have to provide, software material build. We have to provide CUI potential impacts. We have to make sure that it meets NARA. And all of that is part of what the cyber practitioner group has to functionally understand when we put forth some of our edification. And so the good folks at NIST are actually doing that kind of work. And it's great to be involved in that discussion, but it's also a learning curve. And so we're in the effort of creating both cyber and quantum practitioners. And so with that, I'll change the slide. So I've said cyber practitioner, and I get a lot of questions on it. This is how a cyber practitioner has to look at a problem when presented to he or she. We have to understand where the IT perspective of it is. We have to understand where the specialization comes in and where the primary skills come in. I used to observe all the time that you will see cyber attorneys. And remember what I said to you, there's a very large spectrum and they are part of that community discussion. But oftentimes they will take a look at a statement and say, well, we searched in LexisNexis and we didn't find anyone being prosecuted for this particular thing. So if we say we do this, it's a binary answer, yes, we do this. The problem is after that happened so many times, the federal government passed the Federal Evidentiary Act that says that it's not good enough to say you did it. You need to be able to prove it as if you were going in a court of law. That law was passed, and then the Office of Managed Budget started issuing a series of memorandums, and they started issuing a series of edicts. For example, one of the most popular one that is edified is the OMB A130 circular. And this document mandates that every federal organization receives funding from FedRAMP, which is predominantly everyone, has to make sure that all their contractors meet all these new standards. And those standards actually were then encapsulated in controlled and classified information standards. And it had to do with a lot of security flaws that they were finding everywhere. So if you take a look at this diagram, we see that there is a large plethora of people that it's in a cyber practitioner perspective, and everyone's looking at it from their perspective, but a practitioner has to see all of it. This is the kind of model that we would want to develop for a quantum practitioner, right? So the quantum person has to be able to communicate in a Rubicon and a Nexus language that is transferable to a cyber person who can then transfer it to a legal person who can then transfer it to a legislative, that can then transfer it into a funding, that can then contract it into a COTAR. That is missing. And what's occurring is kind of like what we call the old-fashioned snake oil. I'm going to send you something if you don't need it. For example, although this, it's interesting. I presented for InfraGard because I'm on the board of directors over there, and I'm also a corporate officer over there. We presented on a discussion very similar to this, and then we had a lot of zero trust discussions. And in my opinion, zero trust is actually nothing more than an old version of defense in depth. And so we have a term from where I used to work, call that depth and expense. It's very expensive to do. So how do you assess whether or not you're doing zero trust? Well, until the National Institute of Standards and Technology comes out to miss the ISCAM and also miss the FISCAM requirements for auditing and integration, nobody really knows the answer to that question. But you're already seeing vendors selling their zero trust modality because they said that their product does zero trust based on their interpretation without an actual assessment model being associated with it. So this is kind of like we have to understand all this stuff before we can start making assessment models. But if you can take a look on this diagram, you can see very clearly that this affects a lot of people, and a lot of people have to be in agreement before you can move forward. And so this is provided as backdrop. If you'd like to have this slide, of course, we can get it to you. When we take a look at the arena of quantum, and this is provided for our good friends over at the Department of Defense, we can kind of see how the warfighter folks are starting to take a look at this. Well, even though the warfighter and the Department of Defense and others inside the intelligence community look at this, if we start taking a look at how all these things actually have sub-component systems associated with it, all of it has to be protected. So if we took out GPS satellites and we say, well, my car uses a GPS, we can begin to see where the satellites can be affected by quantum. If we think about how NOAA gets its information from its sensors that it deploys out into the ocean, it's the same discussion. Now, these are the military practical applications, but think about how this would affect the modern world. Communications would be affected, international commerce would be affected, banking and financing definitely would be affected. And then moreover, how do we protect personal identity is going to massively change. Even though, again, as I said, this is how the Department of Defense looked at it. The diagram is even interesting when you go back and you take a look at how the Commerce Organization for the Warfighter, again, using the DoD, who's very good at building in OV1s, talks about how business operations may be affected by quantum. That you would have to change your training, your requirements analysts, your maintenance, your movement. How do you do adjudication? How do you buy this stuff? Do you have to build different kinds of centers? Do you have to buy different disposal materials? What kind of just think about all these things. And the issue that we saw at the Quantum Security Alliance that we brought up when we saw these things is, wow, there's no ecospace for this. And so we've partnered with the National Quantum Literacy Network specifically to help start writing these kinds of forward thought leadership pieces that we thought were important to communicate a message, which is this is an all hands, anyone can get into the sport, and we're looking for people that want to really contribute. And so this is just kind of provided, again, as a backdrop. And there's a lot of the products you're seeing here that at some level use software language to complete their activities, whether from time card training to scheduling to booking airfare. There's a lot of stuff written in Python. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a step back because that's a lot to soak in, and I apologize to everybody. I have been a little wordy myself in my life. So what is a scripting language is a good way to enter into this discussion about what we're talking about. And it's nothing more, as you can see, this is actually straight from our good friends at Wikipedia. We wanted to use a more robust discussion, but this one right here, we felt had the best overall comprehensive explanation or an agreement by a subject set of matter of experts. After you have read all of that stuff, we wanted to make sure that we talked about Perl, PowerShell, Python, and Tel, which are all awk processors for SED. And if we take a look at the top, what we did is we did a snapshot to see how many security reported vulnerabilities occurred going back as far as 2008 to forward, because we were talking about, if you remember correctly, in 2009, we saw a significant increase in security vulnerabilities and security problems. And so if you take a look at in 2008, Python had 0 reported security vulnerabilities. But by 2009, there was 353, 42, then 1, and then there was a lack of reporting, and it started picking back up again. What was interesting about the original 353 security vulnerabilities followed by the additional 42 is that most of these are what's called critical path exception security flaws, which means the code itself, the Python code itself, is fraught with security vulnerabilities that are very difficult to mitigate or very elaborate and very intensive solution outcomes. So we're not trying to scare anybody. We're not trying to say that there aren't answers here. We're just providing a review of what we found when we started to look into this. So if we think about this from a different standpoint, APIs, how the modern web works is actually done on these kind of languages because they work very well with web pages. They work very well with scripting interaction. There's a lot of PowerShell. If we take a look at security DevOps is traditionally done in Python. And so if we just take a moment and realize that these are incongruent statements that we're using Python, a known security fraud vulnerability platform, and we're deploying security DevOps on it, we also use this for artificial intelligence. We can begin to see that we are selecting a security product without realizing it. Python is not considered to be a security product, it's considered to be a programming language. But if we take a practitioner level viewpoint of it, imagine what will happen when Quantum finally makes it to the GSA schedule and the GSA turns around and says you can't use Python, and that vendor turns around and says, oh, well, that's not fair. We built the whole thing in Python, and so you have to accept it. That's how it's been done traditionally. Imagine if the government can go out and write its requirement saying that you need to write it so that it has an API adapter that allows us to have shell-like commands, but we have a terminal emulator that we would connect to yours because we need to follow secure software-defined functions in order to connect to you. If we take a step back, we can see NIST has already started down this path. NIST has already begun to start writing out saying what that would look like and how that would be. And so we're very proud at the QSA of saying that we believe we may have helped influence that discussion. But I just want to remind you that per the first year that the vulnerability reported program kicked off, we can see that there was 3,983 that were reported on Perl, 5,326 that were reported, 97. And as they started to mitigate the security vulnerabilities, you can kind of see where, well, PHP and Perl are kind of the same thing. And then PowerShell had some security flaws, but PowerShell didn't have as many as Python in the critical vulnerability standpoints. So with that, I'll just click the slide here. When we do temporal analysis and we use the common vulnerabilities and exposure database overlaid with the national vulnerability database, we found that there were different versions of vulnerability reporting frameworks from 2.0 to 3.0 to 3.1. They use different what's called CVS or common vulnerability scoring systems, and that this open standard, which is constantly updated, looks at base scores, temporal scores, and then we wanted to take a look and see how that changed over time. And so if you see right here in front of you, we've grouped the 2.0 and the 3.1 because there was very, very little change. There was actually some new things that were added. But we looked at what we call the severity score. Where are the severity scores? So initially in 2009, we can kind of see that Perl had 2,023 high CVS scores. And then it was changed to one critical entry when we started using the 3.1 score. And that's because they changed it. They changed it because it was considered to be a little too specific. But we can take a look at how the V2.0, which didn't have such a broad spectrum of analysis, wasn't able to calculate the true temporal security vulnerabilities that were associated with it. And a lot of this has to do with when we looked at high vulnerability scores, and that is anything above an 8.0 is a high severity score. 10 being the worst. You're in serious, serious trouble with the worst. And we can see over to the right, by 2020, they had really started to slow down on the reporting of Perl. And that's because a lot of folks started working on it, and that's the good news. But even though a lot of people were working on it, the total amount of reported vulnerabilities to Perl has not changed. In many instances, as I said before, you cannot mitigate them. And if you do, it's going to be very difficult, and it's going to be very time consuming. So again, we're starting to see how the scoring system changed, the vulnerability did not. And so we're going to the next slide. So we thought we'd be a little bit helpful. Here is Python over the years. And we know the Python was created in 1991. It was a great software package. I will not lie. I do write in Python. I do like Python a lot. There's different versions of terminal emulators. You will find it in Eclipse as one of the packages that you can work with. It's very good, but it was released in 2008. And remember what I was talking about. in 2009, when the first reporting of Python was done, there was a lot of security flaws found with it and a lot of vulnerabilities. And we can take a look over here and we can see that low, medium, high is a temporal thing of saying what this might do to your system. And if you take a look over the right, even on the new system in 2016, which is when the Evidentiary Act was actually brought online, which is in 2016 is when it went into effect, we start to see a change, right? We're starting to see, well, now it's 2, now it's 11, now it's 7, then it's 24. And as of 2020, which is when we closed down the sample set in order to produce this report, it's at 7. And so that means you're seeing an average of about 5 to 6. However, in 2019, during the height of the everybody working from home gear up that we saw for COVID, we started seeing a lot of security reported vulnerabilities in Python. These were unexpected issues that was not originally anticipated. And it's only with the new CVS scoring that was released that we start to discover these overlays. And these are critical path exception, which means if this vulnerability exists in your system, it exists everywhere. And so Python is actually used to program a lot of stuff in cloud. And so a lot of these vulnerabilities were found in cloud subsystems that was unexpected or unplanned. And so if you think a lot of the what we call simple security hacks that we see inside cloud, most of it's done on Python. And so again, this is all provided to make sure that it's not just us. All this stuff is attributed to the National Vulnerabilities Common Weakness Enumeration. And so anyone can go in and retrieve this data. So we're going to step back and we're going to talk a little bit bigger picture. When we searched for the word Python in the vulnerability database, we found that there was 401 actual entries, that it had an average score of 7.685, obviously, and its exploitability score was fairly moderate. Its impact score, which means how well would it impact, we were like, oh. And then when we found the critical vulnerabilities, now this means that you really are in trouble. We found out that the average of those 52 was 9.75. The exploitability score was a little bit higher, almost a full point, but the impact, again, almost 1.2, but it started to align itself to an alarming outcome. You had all of the confidentiality security controls that are called the TAC1 controls out of the 853 Rev 5, they were all being violated. We found out that all the integrity controls, again, the same set of controls that I just mentioned, they were being violated. And in many instances, the availability standards were also being. One of the things that the Cloud Security Alliance does, and one of the things that the Quantum Security Alliance is working with them as a generic partner, is that we track multiple instances of how there's an introspect. We have access into a platform that allows us to track the legal liability of a given organization, regardless of its federal alignment. That means the chance of you committing a federal crime. And so that number you see down there, of the 52, 401 of those vulnerabilities had a 12% chance that you'd be violating a federal law. Some of the laws that have been written since 2018 and 2019 are very alarming, because if you violate one of those federal laws, you could have a conflict with your board of directors. You can have a conflict with your shareholders. You could have a federal investigation to determine whether or not you knew about the security flaw and you didn't report it because you didn't want anyone to know about it. Now, on the right-hand side, just to kind of show you the things that we've tracked, and again, this is the QSA leveraging other people's work, we start to see some of these open common weakness enumeration. Frequency counts for external APIs that are used with the untrusted data, that's a security flaw. It cannot be mitigated at this time. Untrusted data passed to an external API also cannot be mitigated at this time. Bad HTML filtering through the regex expression cannot be mitigated at this time. And everything you're seeing here are the top 20 security vulnerabilities that show up all over the place. The one we didn't list because we didn't feel that we wanted to poke the eye of the Python developers in the face is the one that allowed for the log4j security vulnerability, which then caused a huge security vulnerability inside the United States government. But as we start to see here, we start to see a trend that the way that the code was actually written works, but it's not done in a secured manner. This kind of research, and I'm not talking about the Quantum Security Alliance, but others like the QSA that work very closely with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, realized that without the understanding of those 52 controls that we were just talking about, that the vulnerabilities were going to continue to show up in software throughout the country. This shows up in open source software development all over the place. This shows up in vendor, and this also slowed down vendor adoption. So NIST was tasked from various elements out of the Commerce Department to start working on this. And this is some of the research that they've had at their back pocket to figure out some of these things. And we thought we would share it with you to make sure that we showed our homework, if you will. And again, all of this is completely available online. You can actually go and search for these CW20s, and you can actually read them. It's very interesting. And some of the mitigation strategies of how you might approach this problem are actually found on those websites. On our next slide, I just want to go ahead and walk through a very painful discussion topic that we had recently. What you're seeing here is a copy and paste out of the current cybersecurity workforce framework, which I believe is currently enforced by an executive order that is applicable to the entire United States government. There are no exceptions for this particular executive order that I'm aware of. I could be wrong, but I don't believe that they are. And we looked specifically at the supply chain risk management, and we didn't want to have people hit the escape hatch button. But we want to make sure everybody sees that in the categories for asset management, business environment, governance, risk assessment, management strategy, supply chain, we just wanted to take a look at the supply chain. And we looked at the first one. So in order to get partial credit for meeting the objective of a cyber supply chain risk management processes are identified, established, assessed, managed, and agreed to by all organizational stakeholders, you have to be able to do SA9, SA12, and PM9. And those three controls have a lot of controls that they're related to, unfortunately. And that's by federal regulation standards and oversight from FISCAM and others like them that put out standards of saying this is how the IG shall do an assessment, or this is how an auditor will do an assessment to verify what you're doing. And as I said, when the Evidentiary Act was passed and the Critical Infrastructure Security Act update of both 2019 and 2022, it actually made this step right here into a potential federal crime by not following these standards. The Quantum Security Alliance took it upon itself to use some of our AI engineers, and we asked them to take a look at the standards as written by the National Institute of Standards and Technology to show the incrementation of the controls that start being added when you started to meet the 4 different criteria for security modality. So remember I said partial is the lowest score. We would call that a 1.0, and that means you're doing partial security for supply chain. And risk informed would require the next subset of controls, which is about 43 controls. The next one would cost you, well, somewhere around 117 to 121 controls. And the last one, which is adaptive, which is what Zero Trust strives for, is 243 security controls. I want to make sure that we understand of the 243 controls and the adaptive, some of those don't even exist anymore and actually been wrapped up into the 853 Rev 5 to define which ones are organizational, which ones are situational, and which ones are both. And we start to see this, I have to pay attention to how much stuff in order to make a decision. And so this is just a cyber discussion. We haven't even talked about the impact of what quantum is going to do on this discussion, because all these federal laws apply in a quantum environment, irregardless of the new technology standard that's being developed. What we're seeing is that the technology vendors, that would be D-Wave, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, have already selected the software that you're going to use to talk to their platforms. The vendors have already selected how you're going to talk to their platforms. And what we saw is 87% of them use Python. And so I just want to make sure we take a deep breath after what we've learned to discuss that we have now discovered that Python is theoretically has some concerns and some issues, but it's the predominant way by which we talk to quantum machines. So even if we create a really secure cloud environment, cloud stands a 37 to 45% chance of being breached. Imagine what happens when we can't even secure the cloud system and we're bringing the quantum environment with its attack capabilities to break the cloud system, to break into the quantum system. And so all of these things have to be considered. And these are the kind of things and problems that we at the Quantum Security Alliance have already started to work on to make sure that we, as what we call our future cyber practitioner selves, start to understand these issues. So I've bent your ear on cybersecurity. I promise to get off the soapbox. What I'd like to show you is how the ontology is designed for the secured software development framework. You have a high-level statement. You have a security requirement that's designed. Then you have the identification of the documentation of the security controls. And as you remember, I promised I would show you the real security controls that they're selecting, which is services and system acquisition policies and procedures, security engineer principles, and development process standards and tools. And here are the examples that they talk about, which is, wow, okay. Now, the reason why we bring this up is that you're seeing an example of what would be considered here or there, but the security controls that are selected by NIST actually have an assessment model that sit behind it. And that assessment model is typically emphatic. It's typically, when you see SA-1, there's anywhere between 1 and 31 different sub-assessments to be able to say that, yes, you are actually doing SA-1 per software. So imagine if you tried to do this and you didn't have a centralized system to keep track of all this stuff. This is going to be duplicated responsibility for everyone. Whereas if the government was in the catbird seat, it would mandate this requirement, which is what you're seeing come out of the NIST folks. Hey, you should think about doing these kind of things in advance so that when you bring your product to us, that we can quickly adopt your technology. These are the kind of things that we were in agreement with. And so I want to highlight where it says that you monitor applicable laws and regulations. And so inside the zero trust model, you have to have a governance model that shows you know all the federal laws that are applicable to you. So just taking the 3 security controls that we just talked about, we kind of see that I'm gonna focus on one because I figured you guys again would throw me out the door. Here are the Python issues. In order to be able to use Python, upper management or authorizing officials need to commit to secure development and convey that commitment to all development relation roles and responsibilities in order to meet these 3 controls. In 853, we see that there were 2 DISA-STIGs that addressed this particular discussion, and it was related to risk assessment, RA3. When we went to the 853 Rev 4, which was released a short period of time, about 5 to 6 years total, we saw that they created almost 2 additional more DISA-STIGs, and that the controls stay the same. But however, after the Evidentiary Act and the updated Critical Infrastructure Security Act, I would like to take a look over to the right and see how many controls are now required to be implemented. So even though you're doing just PM9 over there at the top where you're doing your risk management strategy, when it comes to software, you have to do all these sub-controls, and you have to be able to prove to an evidentiary requirement that you actually mitigated those. And all of those controls are brand new as of 2020 and were not published, I believe, until 2021, and they were enforceable as of 2022. And I believe most federal agencies are in the middle of a transition period. But just imagine you went from, okay, I got to go check one control to make sure that this meets this control, to I now have to check 27 additional security controls to make sure that I met the requirement for how I'm implementing Python. As this begins to matriculate, you're going to see this apply to every software code base that the United States uses. And so imagine, if you will, an already difficult discussion such as quantum just got made more difficult. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of water. So I thought it'd be helpful. PM9 is actually directly related to policy and procedures on how you write for confidentiality, integrity, availability, and legal liability and compliance. As we were talking just a moment ago in Rev 3, when you talk about PM9, you're talking about AC1. And when you're talking about AC1, as of the second iteration, you're talking privacy monitoring and auditing, privacy enhancement, system design and development. And then when we got to Rev 5, we were talking about policy procedures, risk management strategy, data and integration and integrity boards, personal sanctions, and information management and retention. And all of those are mapped to legal liability clauses of federal guidelines that have been passed in the recent years to roll back some of the multitude of security violations and multitude of security breaches that happen throughout the U.S. federal government and throughout the commerce at large. And so this just kind of gives you a snapshot of where they're going and how this is going to affect the supply chain for software, specifically from a development standpoint. And as I promised, I wanted to make sure that I fed it to you so you saw it. If you are a corporation and your software or your software development team is alleged to have connections or ties, you could be hit with what's called the CSR 578, and that's actually potentially a Patriot Act violation. And the Patriot Act means that your organization could be considered to be working in relationship with a terrorist organization. And I just want to remind you, we're all talking about Python, but it is possible. And so we want to make sure that we showed our due diligence. However, if you use Python and you have a security breach and you're in direct violation of the Health Information Portability Act, these are the specific elements that you violated. And I won't read those off to you. I'm sure you can read them. However, when we change directions and we go into the Critical Infrastructure Protection Agency Act, we start to see all of the organizational information security policies, which were all of the controls associated across all the TAC 1 controls. Your legal and regulatory requirements are also at risk. Your identities and credentials are at risk. Remote access managed controls are potentially at risk. Your access permission and authorizations are managed is at risk. And your identities are proven and bound to credentials and assertions are at risk. And the reason is because AC1 shows up in every one of those things. And moreover, AC1 is part of your program risk management strategy. And that's usually done at the, kind of like the organizational high level, which is can be done at anywhere, but usually it's done at the highest levels. This is where it gets painful for all my federal and government personnel. We start to see that you have to manage your information as a strategic resource. You have to make sure you're managing your PII. I'm sure none of this is new. You all now have to worry about your FIPS publication 199 for confidential impact is determined by the agency that you're sharing the data. And I want to make sure everybody understands this is all the stuff that we can find. This took us less than about 20 minutes. I'm sure there's more. This is not all inclusive, but this is actually the OMB Circular A130. And this is very interesting because this is what is mandated by OMB that every federal agency impose upon its contracting workforce to make sure that they understand how the data shall be protected and how it should not be utilized. Agencies have to report this information in a quarterly or theoretically an annual report, depending on the nature of the discussion. However, just imagine this is yet another oversight piece that we have to keep track of. And then, of course, our partners recently published our article on the quantum supply chain cyber logistics aspect, where we explore what we see as both the behaviors of foreign nation states in the quantum supply chain and some of the things that we could do. The QSA members, that would be myself, Dr. Hans, and Joe Reddix, and Mr. Aaron Bishop, who is our CEO, came up with what's called quantum poisoning as a service. And this is the ability to create malformed packages that would go through a firewall to break the firewall or to slow it down. And what you do is you find out how far does the malformed package need to be in order to break a certain type of firewall or to slow it down or to break the firewall bit sorter in order to slow it down to the point where you would deaggregate the system. And we were able to figure it out using some really cool mathematics and science, and it took us only about 7 minutes to actually break an ASA 6400 router. So we're very proud of our research, and we were given an opportunity with one of our mission partners to do that. The Quantum Literacy Network is actually an NSF-funded organization, National Science Foundation, and we're very honored to be working with them. And this document is actually on sale for anyone who would like to read it. Now, our partnership with the literacy education includes many different knowledge purveyors in the world that work on how do you start to build the workforce. And so the Quantum Literacy Group is working with educational training with the Army technical groups. They're doing some work inside STEM and quantum supply chain for the defense logistics. They're also doing some interesting work on how you do AI training in order to get some of the areas of quantum to be understood better through the Convergence Accelerator. And we're very happy that we're going to get our actual first briefing on that in about 2 weeks. And so we're extremely excited to work with Dr. Ackers and his team. And we were even more excited to announce that Dr. Ackers has agreed to come and join the Quantum Security Alliance to help make sure that we start to create a national understanding of the importance of a strategic by design educational format program between K through 12, so that we can start finding and identifying individuals that have a learned ability or aptitude in quantum. And we want to make sure that we start to target those individuals. And this is some of the stuff that they've done already. It's very exciting. We were very excited to see some of the presentations and briefings, and we're really excited to show their homework to you. Hopefully this makes sense. But here's some of the bigger things that we were talking about, where you get cognitive perception from quantum literacy, you get cognitive indicators of whether or not the people are getting it. This also is to warfighters when they receive the training. All of these different things can be power checked by AI, and just think about all these really cool stuff that they're talking about, and most of the stuff is done with Python. So we would definitely want to make sure that our enemies wouldn't have the ability to break into the system to figure out what is our actual technical expertise for military. And so all these things kind of come into play. And with that, I think I'm almost to my last slide. This is the I Love Me wall for everyone who's ever seen this one before. I do apologize for the alphabet suit after my name. I'm kind of required to put it there. I do support the U.S. government in different roles and different things. I am currently working on quantum information science. I work in cloud computing. I've done cybersecurity, open source, all kinds of stuff. I have 14 board certifications in cyber forensic investigations, including cryptocurrency. I've supported the Department of Justice, the FBI, and various different federal entities in its efforts to do certain things. Again, as they say, when I was formerly in the Navy, you have a green card, go to work. If I want to hear from you, I'll send you a text message. And I would like to open the floor up for questions and answers. And with that, I will turn off the projector so we can read questions on screen, if that makes sense to everybody.
I wonder if you can go in, and thank you for the amazing presentation. Very informative. I'm going to have to go back and rewatch some parts of this, but a lot of content, and we'll share the slides here. Are you able to talk a little bit more about not only quantum poisoning as a service, but also some of the immediate actions that you would suggest agencies and contractors to be exploring together to start to remediate or mitigate as many vulnerabilities as possible, short of just stopping using Python across the board?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're starting to see some of that, right? So we have to be on the uptick and the positive. The establishment and the creation of a process by which any organizations begins to use the secured software development framework is the first step. Understanding how the the software bill of lading is built, understanding the impact of the cybersecurity framework, not as independent things, but as actual ecosystems of checks. So we see a lot of folks go, oh God, another regulation. Actually, if you were to take a deep breath, it's the same regulation with a different perspective. It actually did not change at all. And so that's one of the major misnomers that we see in cybersecurity. And a practitioner is not the same person that's there to scare the devil out of you, right? It's our job is to come in and give you a cogent answer. Threat vulnerability, threat intelligence, understanding what your assets are, all of these things are the cornerstone of how you would do proper cybersecurity. When we think about a Rubik's Cube, we can think of the 4, we can think of the 6, we can think of the 9, we can even think of the 20. But sometimes when we think about these things as practitioners, we get a little too wrapped up in the details, the nuance, if you will. But unfortunately, cybersecurity is like the nuance of how computer systems work to exchange information that may or may not need to be shared with the general populace, or may or may not want to let anyone know how these things work together. And so one of the things that I teach in my students at the University of Maryland was we would ask them a simple word. And if anyone wants to type the answer in the text message, this is part of the fun part. If a cyber person comes to you and says, what does the word access mean in a cybersecurity discussion? We will have many different answers. Typically, one of the smartest and brightest people in the room will turn around and say, well, it's whatever NIST says, right? And we're like, well, technically, you're absolutely right when it comes to a commerce area of responsibility. And then invariably, you have one guy in the room that's very, very quiet, and you have to prod them to ask that person, or he or she in that instance, and they'll turn around and goes, well, it depends on what the CNSI 4009 says. And then you know that you've crossed between how the traditional person looks at it and someone who works in real threat intelligence. It talks about it. And the CNSI 4009 definition, by comparison, has 47 more words than the Commerce Department definition, and it's much more stringent as definitional. And what's really funny to me as a practitioner is that people will come back and say, well, access is the ability to do this and this and this with an information resource, and they're absolutely correct. The problem is it from a FISCAM standpoint, we're actually talking about public key infrastructure. We're talking about PKI keys. That's actually what we're talking about. And so just think of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about access, and then the cyber guy's like, no, we're talking about public key infrastructure because that's the assessment modality assigned to that word. And so cyber folks took words that were common lexicon understood and changed their definition to meet what we wanted it to say and forgot to tell everybody about it. Well, I just told you, according to NIST, all public key infrastructure fails when quantum becomes realized, quantum computing. And there are multiple different types of computers. So what I would suggest is that everybody obviously read the 218 from NIST and really start to think about, is my organization going to benefit from this instruction, or are we going to have some hindrance? And if we're going to have hindrance, my recommendation is have someone start to get very, very knowledgeable on it. Go and find out who the authors are from NIST. Get those people in your room and talk to them and make sure, am I understanding this and what is the assessment modality? One of the things that's missing from the 2018 is the steps of how you actually do proper cybersecurity, which are often missed. If your infrastructure is unsecured, it doesn't matter what you put on it. It's like building a building on a cardboard foundation. It's going to eventually collapse. So that's how everyone has to begin to have this discussion. As a former submariner, the way that I like to describe cybersecurity is watertight doors, right? So on a submarine, if the water gets into the people tank, it's a bad thing. So we design watertight doors to keep the water away from the people. If we take the word people out and we say data, it's the same concept. We just want to keep all the bad people away from the data instead of the water from the people, and we get the same discussion. So everything that we have to look at in the cyber practitioner world is what we're starting to see this really alarming trend is if we just think about how bad the SolarWinds breach was, that was actually not poor software design, it was poor information assurance implementation. But it led to an Okta breach, and the Okta breach was based on the exact same pattern because the vulnerability wasn't fully understood and shared. So software for all of the different organizations begins with making a high-level meeting at the GS15 and a slide deck that's very clear, very cogent. Hey, this is coming. We need to start taking these steps, but we need to blend this into our overall cyber policy and procedure. And what we really need is a policy that says we're going to do this so that we can begin to train our staff on this stuff. Create a training program that then has the Carousels of the world, create a training modality in order to get that in front of your staff so you can start teaching them. Because right now, this is a situational awareness problem. People are getting trained on stuff like, and the DoD as secretary, that's someone who types up an email and does calendars, has to be a certified CISSP in order to touch the system. No, that's not what was meant by the cybersecurity framework and the cybersecurity workforce framework. It said anyone that came into contact with the configuration and routing of a switch or any physical system, not that someone sat there and touched it. And the reason is because you used the NIST definition instead of the CNSI 4009 definition. That was to kind of prove you the fight there that exists between the modality agencies. So get together with some very smart people and challenge them to come up with a full ecosystem of what we call soup to nuts way of approaching a cyber practitioner discussion where there is no wrong answer, starts that discussion in a very positive way. And then the most biggest thing is there's no such thing as a dumb question and no such thing as a dumb answer. The ones that's not asked and the one that's not answered, that's where we have our problems, because people are scared to say something and have everybody think they're stupid. And that works against us in this environment. So hopefully that answers a little bit of the question a little bit better, Cody.
And was there anyone that was okay to ask a question while we continue recording? If so, please come off mute. I see Eric Fears has raised his hand.
Right. I appreciate the analogy of designing waterproof doors for a submarine, but that is a finite, understandable kind of engineering problem versus what we're talking about with cybersecurity, because anything that one can program an event, someone is going to eventually discover a way around that. So isn't there some consideration that maybe we ought to adopt a different mindset about how security works in the cyber world, instead of just absolute prevention, but more around detection and mitigation?
I will answer that in a couple of different ways. The ability to detect an attack means that the breach has already occurred. So the decision is to throw our hands in the air and to wait for the attack to occur, and then we do something. What I would say to you is that I see both sides of that argument, and I have to be fair that both sides have a legitimate argument. Talking to a chief technology officer who is having to talk to the chief financial officer, and the CFO turns around and said, we spent $12 million last year on cyber. We didn't get breached. I'm not going to spend $12 million again this year because we didn't get breached, is a false negative positive reinforcement. We spent $12 million and we didn't get busted. If we try to do everything after the fact, it's a cyber black swan event, similar to what happened in SolarWinds, right? SolarWinds was detected a full 18 months before it occurred. A full 18 months. It was detected, but nothing was done about it. And it's because the vulnerability reporting requirement that was put out through the federal law hadn't been implemented yet. And the law, as written by the Office of Management and Budget and overwritten by the Critical Infrastructure Act, says that an organization has exactly 24 hours to report to U.S. CERT that they've had a security breach. Not 72 hours like the SEC is talking about, but they have 24 hours if they are doing business with the United States government. That is not a debate. It's written in law. What they don't talk about is in that same exact law is what happens next. U.S. CERT goes in and collects the forensic investigative data in order to figure out exactly what happens and turns the whole thing over, and they do their analysis, and then they show it to the FBI, who then does their analysis and remands charges to DOJ, and then DOJ takes up for prosecution. That step did not used to exist. So if we take a step back from that and we see what the CMMC program is, it's the detection of a false claim statement, right? A false statement to a federal agency or federal organization in order to act as a deterrent. So far under the False Claims Act, the Department of Justice only had 10 lawyers as early as 2017. They now have over 1,500 lawyers working nonstop on doing false statement claims and prosecution. So the concept that we're going to wait for the event to occur means that it's not one organization, it's multiple organizations all waiting for the inevitable. The problem is, actually, it's an economic problem. It has nothing to do with the organization, it has nothing to do with me, it has nothing to do with you. I believe this, is it Eric? Did I say it right, sir? I want to make sure I didn't say it incorrectly. It's a totally different. We, as a government, don't have the economic squanderfulness of the income money to keep paying for these mistakes. The OPM breach cost 27.7 million U.S. active duty and their families their identity to Russia, China, and various different entities inside Soviet Eastern Bloc organizations that took that identity and ran with it.
If
that is something that can't be, that was totally detectable, and it was. But what happens is when we don't create these modalities that said we need to behave this certain way, is that someone comes in and says, well, I didn't have the software tool to detect that vulnerability, and so I didn't have that vulnerability. And we have seen that testimony to Congress by multiple different organizations, sir.
So my comment wasn't that we completely forget about prevention and just go for detection. It was rather the amount of time that is focused on prevention versus detection. And yeah, you talked about a great number of laws and other modalities, but that would be part of the discussion, is changing the mindset on how you approach cybersecurity rather than, it being an after the fact cleanup, but more of a how do we detect these and shut them down in real time or ahead of time if at all possible.
And according to the good folks at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, it's resiliency by design. It's called baked-in security. The principles of what we're describing here is baked-in security philosophy, right? Am I aware of every possible conceivable thing that I should have thought of before I made the decision is going to be the cybersecurity mantra, because it's been codified into federal law. It's not a discussion that's been done. It's the implementation, sir, that I think that you have a valid comment on. But the decision to go down this path has already been made. It's already in written law. The Evidentiary Act mandates that all federal organizations, all federal agencies have to achieve this objective, and they have to pass it on to every major prime and every subprime. When we talk about a software package such as an open source Python, we have to start taking a look at the fact that it was written because someone didn't like the way that another piece of code that worked that was 100% secured. So they went and created this one because it made sense to them. This person was never trained in cybersecurity. What we are seeing as a national byproduct is that people will go out and do the simplest thing to build a product, but they actually don't consider whether they should have. And I'll steal a quote that was put out a couple weeks ago. So I loved it. We're now into cyber Jurassic Park. We now have security being compromised by generative AI tools that are written to hack into environments. And that is a real thing. And it is not being done by the United States. It's being done by Russian state-sponsored actors, and they're doing it nonstop. This is supported by the fact that ChatGPT, which is a great, phenomenal technology, and it was awesome. No one asked the question, should we have done that before we understood how to secure it? And so you have a movement of technology people to say, well, I don't want your security to interfere with what I'm doing, so I'm just not going to do it. If we take a look at a classic discussion such as Hadoop, and that is a very nebulous conversation, I apologize for the classic discussion. Hadoop was introduced into the US government without a shred of cybersecurity modality or thought leadership to it at all. When we were done, we spent somewhere north of almost $900 million trying to make it secure. And it's because the people that built the software didn't want to be responsible for putting the security on it. So we had to go and retroactively put it on there, and it's twice as expensive as to do it if it was designed as part of the process. And that's all we're trying to do. I think that's the security flaw in quantum. Quantum has absolutely zero quantum cyber practitioners that are allowed in the room to tell the quantum physicists, you can't do that, and here's the reason why. Python is a completely unsecured platform language, and you shouldn't really be using it. Go find another language or write one that's secured. If you take a look at what the government's doing now, is they're creating a whole strategic national initiative to create secure, fundamental, by design, open source adoption, where once it comes in, it gets ripped into an Eclipse module and it's released out of the National Security Agency, or it's released out of the National Geospatial Agency, depending on who is the one that's writing it. But it's no longer going to be drop code out into the environment. So if I want to bring down your AI system, I'm just going to give you a bad data set, make it so it's dumb. And so no one thinks that we're going to do that kind of stuff. But people that are out in that world that think about those kinds of things can break into a system very, very quickly. To be very quick, a 6-year-old at the hackathon this year showed how he broke into a bank using Python. And there's a recording of it. So it's not like this is a very hard language to learn. And so we as cybersecurity experts don't like script language running around in our environment because it acts as a system administrator. It can do anything it wants, and it can do it at machine language, which means it looks like a virus for early detection software. But I agree with you, sir. It can't just be the stick. It has to have some thought process. It has to have some mature discussions about how we would proceed there. And I do appreciate your question, sir. I thought it was very well. It's apropos, and I agree with your viewpoint, sir, at a level.
Zach, did you want to ask the final question on the record here, and then we'll wrap it up?
Sure. I was just going to ask if there are, to your knowledge, any efforts to have or grow white hat bounties for open source projects just to expose further vulnerabilities? Because I know a lot of large companies like Apple, Google, etc. They have bounties for vulnerability finding in their products, and it seems like open source would be somewhere that has sort of a dearth of that effort.
To my understanding, the national cyber strategy was very clear in saying that they were going to start building processes for adopting a very far-reaching approach to how they were going to change the landscape of viewpoint, right? So it's just not, we're going to start throwing things over the fence and expect agencies to come to terms with it. I think that there's a national strategic initiative that is called out in an awareness training requirement and initiative that's buried in there to keep people up to speed. That very well, as you describe it, could be a part of that. But right now, if we take a step back, under penalty of law, organizations that provide software to the U.S. government are required right now today under federal law to report that. If we go and take a look at what the SEC almost did, which is very interesting, the SEC was told, oh, we're going to make it so that if you don't meet it by this criteria, you've defrauded your investors. We're going to open up an SEC investigation into you. And everybody went, oh, God, don't do that. So they went from 24 hours, which is similar to the OMB, and they said, okay, fine, you have 5 days. I can let you know that if you wait to detect a hack, you could already be owned. It typically only takes a hacker about 7 to 12 minutes to do a ransomware attack and start encrypting volumes. And in most instances, it takes 24 hours to detect those kinds of attacks, especially when they're being very well crafted and it's not a brute attack. We think of a sophisticated attack as something that will last for 9 to 14 months and we'll detect it over time. You can use a quantum machine to create the perfect attack pattern right now. And you can optimize it and optimize it and optimize it. And once you have the math, the binary language of how you do it, you can actually have generative AI program the attack pattern. And it would not, it's like a 0-day attack. These systems would never detect it. They're just not responding to 0-day. They got to wait for someone. Remember, computers are dumb and the people that operate them have to make them smart. We have to wait for someone to go, hey, what's that? And then they have to go do their investigation and do their steps. That's where the manual process is, and humans cannot operate currently at the speed of a computer, and that is something that becomes very nascent and ugly when you realize that I can do a quadratic set of calculations to figure out every permutation of what the human might do and code the thing up as a binary attack pattern, and there's absolutely nothing that we could do to stop it. I'm not saying that's available today. I'm saying there's organizations working on that kind of technology as we are speaking, and it's not necessarily us. Of the top 75 programmers in quantum, 50 of them live in China, the other 25 live in Russia. We come in at a distant 275th in the world when it comes to quantum design and development and training programs.
Yeah, I guess sort of to add to that question that I'd asked, so for open source code, a lot of the contributors may be at will. They might be academic institutions or so on. Who's going to be held accountable for those vulnerabilities, especially if there's no one, sort of assigned to look for those. There's no incentive for people to publicly look for those and expose them publicly.
Every organization that does business with the U.S. government or pays taxes in the United States is required to do this now. And if they're not doing it, they can find themselves in an actionable environment. So I agree with you that the message hasn't reached the criticality, if I'm being fair about it. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to raise the awareness of, hey, there are a lot of new things that are going on. As a cyber engineer, we can be prosecuted for making a bad cyber decision. As a cybersecurity practitioner, you can be prosecuted for making a bad cyber decision. We used to just buy the tools and plunk them on the network and say they're on, and we patted ourselves on the back. We have to understand now that we have a higher level of responsibility to protecting the data that's being transmitted. For instance, if you go and you take a look at the privacy AI framework, that was not written with a lot of AI people involved. It was actually written by attorneys that were tasked to take that project over to help write the risk management framework to meet that privacy laws were not being violated by the use of artificial intelligence. And the reason is because it was, right? Go take a look at the lawsuits to Microsoft and lawsuits to Amazon. They were taking children's voices in order to create better chatbots to talk to children. Now, that's a large language processing model they built that we now call Chat GPT, but they actually use children's voices in order to create some of the things in there. That's illegal. That's very, 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 very illegal. And it violated numerous federal laws. And when the engineers were brought in the room and they were asked that question, like, I don't know that stuff. Why are you asking me this stuff? You told me to build a software package, and so I did. And then you're telling me that I broke a law. I didn't even know about that law. How would I know about that law? And this is where the problem is starting to rear its ugly little head. Jurassic Park says we did something, but we really didn't understand what we're doing when we did it. And after the fact, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't put the toothpaste back in the toothpaste bin either. Once it's out, it's out. That's the problem with generative AI. That's the problem with artificial intelligence. And we have to start coming up with a national strategy. You know, it begins with conversations like this. This is a great first conversation of like, okay, well, you said this, but what about that? And I think that's where the open dialogue occurs. And cyber practitioners such as myself and others have to be open to the fact that we may need to expand our knowledge base too, and not just be so practitioner oriented. We need to be able to understand multiple disciplinary areas, because if not, I think the gentleman really said it plainly. We're going to drive people crazy saying no all the time, but not being able to explain why we said no. So it's kind of like Because I Said So. There's a popular movie with Diane Keaton. My wife loves to quote it to me when we talk cyber. Because I said so. And she goes, that's not a cyber policy. That's just you being who you are. And so great question, sir. But I think that's how we start the discussion.
Yeah, so it sounds like from what you're saying, for example, if some company uses and rebrands MIT licensed open source software, that it's on that company to make sure that it's secure.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. And if they sell it to the United States government and it has a security flaw in it and it is discovered, that entity organization may be legally liable for making a false claims or a false statement to the U.S. government that the system went through this due rigors. Now, bear in mind, let's say you do all those things, sir. The government has a due diligence requirement to repeat those steps to make sure that they're not buying the stuff. And they didn't used to, but they do now. And so let's just say that some of the things that I've seen in the last 25 years in cybersecurity is very interesting, but the stuff I've seen in the last 13 years just kind of makes me laugh a little bit, because we see a lot of folks using snake oil in order to confuse people with stuff. And so then, for example, there's an argument going over who is the owner of Kaspersky Labs. Depending on who you talk to, it's an American-based company. Those of us in the world know exactly who owns that company. So it's just a different conversation. And so but I didn't know that. There's conversations about how China is influencing the adoption of technology to force us in a specific direction. But if we take a look at China's behaviors, when when Intel was about to release a brand new Qualcomm-enabled chip about 4 years ago that was going to go ballistic, and it was actually going to make the Qualcomm chips for cell phones and CPU processors 800 times faster, China went and bought all the base materials that you would need to produce those chips to make sure they didn't make it to the market until they had figured out how to reverse engineer them in their own manufacturing plants. So when I said that there's an economic play in this discussion, the countries, plural, are fighting over who's going to get to first place in the quantum. And we tend to enter in the race late, but we tend to make up because we have really smart people. And that's the intent. We're trying to find smart people to come and help, think through the steps, sir. So it's not just, hey, we got to find. No. How do you do it in a quantum environment? How do you do it when you have a quantum environment ecosystem come into contact with the cloud system, and how we do it to make sure that none of us get in trouble along the way? Well, you're going to have someone come in the door and say, we did all that. Now where's the profit? And that's where the cyber practitioners have to understand that that's where that discussion really rubber meets the road, because what you see is that the business people make all decisions and all the cyber stuff gets put to the side until they have a client that buys it. And that's the traditional market to strategy approach for most of Silicon Valley, who produces a lot of software that ends up getting broken into. Robin, Tumblr, Discord.
Do you think independent researchers who go after the bounties that large companies typically have would be strong for finding these vulnerabilities in quantum related software?
I don't think it's a bad idea. I think that right now we're at a stage where the proposal of the idea is there would have to be, in my opinion, a creation of a government organization or entity that has the responsibility, even if it's just a division, to start crafting quantum national strategic policy that's outside the technical realm. So we're not talking about how you build the technical devices. That's being handled by many different federal agencies. What we're talking about is what happens when this thing becomes real. And it really shows up, and I really got to do it, and I really got to adopt it. How do I get into the supply chain? How do I get it on the GSA schedule? Which one is the one that I want? How do I write up my use? All of that stuff is not being thought of. What you're seeing here is this stuff is in the back of a garage somewhere. It looks really cool. Hey, do you want to come play with it? For example, if you go to Sandia National Research Labs, it's incredible. Theirs is really cool, by the way. But how many people can sit there and say they've gone to Sandia to take a look at that stuff to go, oh, this is really cool, So a bounty system is an incentivized system. That the other approach is being given is that if we start to design the systems from its original concept with security in mind, we solve the underlying larger problem. Is that over time we'll heal the entire subsystem, and I believe that's the viewpoint of the government at writ large, without specifically saying who. I think that's the approach that they're taking. It's kind of like loose lips sink ships. So they're just trying to start to educate the American people. This dialogue and conversation was based on all information the U.S. government has taken upon itself to go out and collect, organize, structure, and all we did was present it in a viewpoint. And it's all very clear. If you'd like to go and represent what we did, you can actually go and pull the data sets. It's not we don't own it. We basically would go do the same thing you would go do, is go procure it and find out the answers. And there's only 9 CNAs. There's only 9 CNAs. Out of those 9 CNAs, they receive 57,000 reported vulnerabilities a day, and they can only process, I think it's 1 every 30 days. So the wait for someone to notify us that the vulnerability is there is often limited by the amount of people that want to work on the work. This is very tedious stuff.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking of is the so-called independent researchers, security researchers, that would be averse to foreign government involvement, like for example, people that are in Siberia who all they do all day is try to break into systems. They would be incentivized by a cash reward of $1 million or so. And that's what some private companies have done. If it's a U.S. government bounty or incentive, financial incentive, I guess, how do we incentivize them to come try to break into these systems and divulge those vulnerabilities?
Right now, if you got an ethical hacker that would actually be crazy enough to try to break into some of these security systems, they would be facing 15 to 25 to life, because all these secured systems that you're talking about breaking into are no joke. You will go to jail. So to sit there and say that a company such as, and it doesn't matter, Amazon's going to pay for someone to come in and break into their stuff and tell them what's wrong with their cross connector, that is a business decision that can impact their business. If it affects their market structure line, they're going to be very, very vocal about not allowing that to happen. And what we will find out, sir, is the QEDC, which is funded by the Fortune 500 companies, which is the outreach arm of NIST and the White House, are going to be very, very livid to find out that they need to now have people come and tell them how their stuff doesn't work properly. And that's a political discussion, as I think you're kind of alluding to, sir. And that's way outside the realm of my discussion topic, because what we were talking about is the process by which a software product is being selected and integrated into a tool that is fraught with very, very bad security, flawed design. Why would we do that? And the answer is, it was free and it's easy to use. Those are the actual 2 system requirements for the selection of Python for quantum. Not, hey, it has the least amount of vulnerabilities. Hey, it has the least amount of notified CWEs. Not that, hey, this is the easiest to patch, configure, and write secure modules. None of that came up. None of it came up saying, oh, there's an audit trail that we can do this, and you can do this with the memory card. None of that came up. What it was this is cheap, this is easy. A 10-year-old could use it. Let's go do quantum machines on it and see what happens. And so I think
that's the problem, though. If it's adopted and some guy in Siberia is virtually untouchable by a government, because he's in the middle of nowhere. You know, he might have some financial incentive in the black hat community to infiltrate that. You know, it'd be nice if there's a way to incentivize that a little bit more proactively for the benefit of our society rather than the, you know, international black hat community.
And I do believe there is a national bounty program that it's actually sponsored out of the Critical Infrastructure Security Agency. I believe that's a true statement. What I would go so far as to say is that the United States does not suffer from Maslow low order needs problems, which is that we, as a country, tend to be able to find people that can find food. We find people that have the ability to find lodging, and they can find a roof over their head, and their basic needs are met. We are fighting a fight where people are, if I hack this, you say that you'll put a piece of bread in my thing so I can take home and feed my family. That's what we're actually fighting against currently. When we see that kind of behavior, we can espouse, I believe, a great discussion about, you know, that for another day. But we have to, as cyber practitioner, realize that if you're told that this is the only way that you're going to eat, and then an entity that can't touch you because of international borders to prosecute you, what do I care? Right? Because I got to eat yesterday and my family got to eat yesterday. And that's really that is really the impetus of some of these cyber hacks that we see. I'm not talking about organized crime, because organized crime is about the money. But they go out and find people that are in very, very financial distress, and they offer them enough money in order to make it incentivized, similar to what you're saying, sir. So are we going to authorize currently? Well, guess what? Federal law says we cannot deputize the entire United States in order to react to an attack. It has to go through process. Because once that cat's out the bag, we can't put it up, right? So this kind of goes back to the argument around Stuxnet. This is just a general discussion. You know, people got mad because they found out that Stuxnet was this or Stuxnet was that. The end result is that 6 months after whoever wrote Stuxnet, it found it into the open world. It found it back in the United States in under 6 months, and it had been modified. It was 10 times as nasty as it was when it may have allegedly left. So code is that way. And the ICS control systems did not and were unable to detect that type of attack because it was designed specifically not to be detected. Hope that helps out.
Dr. Watchorn.
Yes, sir.
I hate to be that guy, Zach. I hate to be that guy because I think this discussion is great. We are looking to have a collaboration with the Cyber COI in the near future, so we can continue this discussion at that time. I do have to sign off, so I think that does end I think it ends the meeting. So if it doesn't, you guys can feel free to chat, but I am going to end the recording. But thank you.
And I'll put my email in case anybody wants to email the additional questions. Okay, Cody?